At the end of World War II, 1,200 citizens from the city of Weimar were rounded up and ordered into the liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. The US Army wanted them to witness a horrifying collection of artifacts found among thousands of dying prisoners.
There are 2 heads which have been shrunk to 1/5 their normal size. These and other exhibits of Nazi origin are shown to the townspeople. On a table for all to gaze upon is a lampshade made of human skin, made at the request of an SS officer's wife.
That officer's wife was Isse Koch. Her husband was the commander of Buchenwald. Together, they presided over the camp in which 100,000 people died. She would personally select prisoners, sentence them to death, and force fellow inmates to decorate their skins for her amusement.
She was even worse than some of the SS. She was a sadist, she used to enjoy it.
She was known as the bitch of Buchenwald. Born in rural Saxony in 1906, Isse Koch was the daughter of a laborer. Little is known of her modest upbringing, but by the age of 15, she was working at a cigarette factory.
She was not terribly well educated. By the standards of the time, she was lucky to receive the job at the tobacco company as a clerk typist, and that's what she was doing in 1932, about the time that Hitler begins his rise to power.
The young Ilse was instantly attracted to the hard-line politics of the far right.
She joined the party in April 1932, and that's a fairly early date. A lot of people joined the party in the late 30s.
Ever ambitious, Ilse became a Nazi secretary. She was singled out by Himmler, head of the SS, for marriage to a friend of his, Karl Koch. Koch was widely known for his sadistic tendencies as commander of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. He was notorious for his methods of torture.
Himmler liked Koch and viewed him as a protege, viewed him in many ways as a model concentration camp commander, often held him up to other commanders as the one to emulate.
They were the perfect Nazi couple. One evening in 1936, the couple married in a grove of oak trees. Ilse was 30, Karl 10 years older. His new bride didn't mind Karl's reputation as a cruel disciplinarian. She believed in her husband and was proud to have risen from the working classes to the Nazi elite. In 1937, Karl was appointed commandant of a new concentration camp and SS training center at Buchenwald.
She and her husband Karl Koch arrived when the camp opened in July 1937 as the brand new commander of a brand new camp.
Buchenwald was one of the first and largest incarceration facilities in Nazi Germany. It was a hostile, isolated place on the outskirts of Weimar. The camp held up to 10,000 male prisoners. They were a mixture of Jews, Russians, Eastern Europeans, and political opponents. The weak were killed, and the healthy worked to death. The camp was for hard labor, not extermination. Unlike Auschwitz, gas chambers weren't needed. Life expectancy was 3 months. As the wife of the commandant, Ilse led a life of luxury and privilege with her 2 children. All around her, brutality and degradation thrived. Although she had no official rank in the camp, she enjoyed the power that came with her position.
She took it on herself to mingle in the camp's running and affairs. And it was that process that gave her the nickname among the prisoners of Commandeuse, the woman commander.
The prisoners were ruled by fear. Life was worthless and murder a daily occurrence.
I think Isse Koch was drawn into that. I think along with her husband, she began to believe that they could punish Germany's enemies in any form, however humiliating, however degrading it might be. In fact, the more humiliating, the better.
Imagine a system where the rule of law does not prevail, where in concentration camps there are no laws other than the laws which are the whim of the people running the place. Terrifying, but perhaps for the people actually running the place, exhilarating.
As the prisoners lived in fear of their lives, the Kochs lived in luxury. They built their dream home just outside the perimeter fence.
The officers lived on a street just outside a camp. They called it Officers' Row. Rather comfortable existence with a row of what were called villas. The biggest villa was the Koch Villa, where Ilse lived during this whole time.
So for her, it was something very special and extraordinary to live in a big house with even servants, that meant prisoners from the camp, doing everything for her.
As the commandant's wife, Ilse began to revel in the power she held over her prisoner slaves.
Well, some prisoners, for example, would park in the garden or even in her kitchen. And the reports say that it was always unclear what would happen the next moment, whether she would feel fine and everything is done well from her perspective, or whether she would say the person didn't fulfill his duties as a slave to her household, and then she could easily say he should be punished back in the camp.
She liked prisoners to address her as gnädige Frau, which means gracious lady, a kind of term that would have been used to the nobility in the 18th or 19th century.
To go with this title, Ilse enjoyed aristocratic pursuits.
Early in the camp's history, a special riding hall was built. Buchenwald report says it probably cost 250,000 marks to build this structure. 30 prisoners were injured or died in the construction of that riding hall, and it was mainly for her own personal use. And as a matter of fact, she took daily lessons there or daily exercise rides, at some points accompanied by music. So a band was there to play for her, creating an atmosphere a little bit like a circus.
This exorbitant lifestyle was paid for by money the couple stole from prisoners. Ilse enjoyed dominating the inmates. As one of few women at an all-male camp, she would mock the dying prisoners with her sexuality.
She loved clothes. She loved to wear provocative clothing. There's a lot of accounts about her wearing short skirts and tight blouses, and in fact exhibiting herself to the prisoners and the guards. She had an ongoing quarrel with several of the officers' wives, and I think became increasingly an isolated figure among them because she was so different from the rest and so showy. She would be lying in bed with a nightgown on or very, very flimsy clothing and ask the male prisoners to come and serve her or bring her food and other things. And obviously she wanted to show herself off. She wanted her body to be seen by these prisoners. So she liked to tease.
Unlike other German women, Ilse didn't have to do any housework.
In the Nazi ideal home, a housewife would spend a great deal of her day on chores. But if you live in a really privileged household, and of course the SS was the aristocracy in Nazi Germany, then you don't have these chores. And so all you can really do is amuse yourself. And different people amuse themselves in different ways. Some may read, listen to music, and others may go out and view concentration camp prisoners being put through their paces.
She was interested in watching the punishments and did take part in that, and often ordered prisoners to be punished. One time when a work detail went by the Koch Villa, she ordered them punished because some of the men had stared at her. Ironically enough, she wanted them to stare at her, and that was the whole point of the provocative clothing. But any male prisoner who dared stare at the commandant's wife often had lashes or punishment, or perhaps even sent to the cell block, which often meant death.
With time on her hands, she looked to the camp for entertainment. New prisoners had to spend their first night standing naked in the square.
One of the famous stories in the Buchenwald report is that she and some officers' wives went to watch male prisoners who were standing naked at roll call, and apparently took great interest in what she saw.
Temperatures could go down to 20 centigrades minus. Lots of snow, and even then prisoners would have to stay on the roll call place sometimes for hours, not only to be counted but also to punish. And some really decided better to run into the electric fence and to commit suicide to survive under these conditions.
While starving prisoners were committing suicide, the Kochs went short of nothing.
At one point, several prisoners went into her cellar, and they were supposed to shovel coal. And they happened to see that there were rows of bottles of wine and champagne. There were hams. There were other kinds of foodstuffs that were extremely scarce. And I think the prisoners were shocked when they discovered that.
Yes, I sometimes used to look out through the fence and seeing sometimes civilian people pass, and I thought to myself, these people are free, they eat, they're human beings, and we were treated as subhumans.
As the Nazi war machine became bogged down on the Eastern Front, Ilse was treating her death camp like a playground. This was only the beginning of Ilse's terror. There was a far more gruesome side to her that was about to be unleashed. Isse Koch, the camp commandant's wife, was so feared by the prisoners that she was known as the bitch of Buchenwald. New arrivals quickly learnt why she was called the bitch.
We arrived in Buchenwald half dead, hardly walking. The SS allowed us to go in for a shower, and then they disinfected us with a disinfectant powder, and then we got some clothes on, and I was put into a barrack with some Russian prisoners of war. Well, everybody was talking about it, and some of the prisoners, you know, when they passed the square, the big square there, they were terrified because she could lash out just at anybody.
Ilse wasn't content with the daily physical and mental abuse she dished out to prisoners. Her bullying took a much darker twist.
Dr. Wagner was one of the camp doctors with whom Ilse was friendly. She apparently had several friends among the camp doctors. And he needed to do a dissertation. The topic for his dissertation was tattooing. He was supposed to find out if tattooing was an indicator of criminal behavior. And so began the project of collecting tattoos from the skin of prisoners. It was the wife of the commandant, it was Isse Koch, who suggested the project and suggested collecting the tattooed skin.
Ilse used this study to create one of the most enduring and revolting works of the Third Reich. She began using prisoners' skin to make lampshades and book covers. She preferred to choose her victims personally.
The prisoners alleged that she would go to places like the quarry on horseback and watch them work, often without shirts on, and that she would identify a prisoner with an interesting tattoo, write his number down. A day or two later, that prisoner would end up dead.
When we arrived in Buchenwald from Auschwitz, we were a bit worried because we heard that people who came with numbers from Auschwitz on their arm, if she liked the number, she used to send them into the place to have it cut out and put it on the lampshades.
Ilse commandeered the camp workshops to produce these artifacts. Prisoners were forced to decorate the skins of their dead comrades.
Apparently many of the objects of human skin were given away as gifts, and there was a special workshop, an artist studio actually, at Buchenwald. They bound books and they created works of art, many of which are shipped to other camps.
The Buchenwald doctors were indulging in other bizarre experimentation.
The pathology lab had several shrunken heads. Why they prepared them is hard to imagine. There's something barbaric about that too, but apparently one of the camp doctors had read about how South Sea Islanders did this. He decided to try it on a prisoner.
These heads were said to have decorated Ilse's dining room, where she entertained guests and played with her children. For those who didn't witness these macabre objects, their existence seems hard to believe.
Frankly, if I didn't know what else went on at the camp at the same time, I too might doubt it. But having seen examples of medical experiments where they took organs out of living prisoners, where they had the typhus lock and they experimented with typhus, where they operated on homosexuals to change their sexual orientation, where they burned prisoners with phosphorus to see how to treat phosphorus wounds, where they shot prisoners with poison bullets. When all of these things are going on at Buchenwald camp as a matter of routine business, then the existence of these skins in the pathology lab is not so unusual.
The prisoners who weren't victims of experiments faced a battle for survival.
On a Sunday we used to get 2 boiled potatoes and jackets, and I couldn't eat the peels because it used to burn me. I was very thin, just like a skeleton, and as I started peeling, some Hungarian Jews came in and held their hand underneath as I was peeling and taking the peels and eating it. And I felt somehow, I've never felt so bad. Here I'm starving, and here the people taking my peels to eat, just to try to survive. It was a very pathetic situation.
In total contrast to the emaciated prisoners, the high-living Kochs stepped up their racketeering. They stole gold teeth and jewelry from the prisoners and deposited the plunder in secret Swiss bank accounts.
Her husband and she were trying to grab as much as they could from their position. That means they also came into conflict with rules of the SS itself.
I think one of the key factors in the fall of the Kochs is that many of the camp guards witnessed this corruption and resented it to some extent, that the Kochs were using embezzled funds to enjoy a very lavish lifestyle. He bought a big car, he bought a boat, bought a house on a lake, all this on a salary that was a modest salary, at least officially. People began to ask questions, where is the money coming from?
In 1942, the couple were charged with corruption by an SS court. Karl took the blame and was sent to run a Polish extermination camp to be sentenced at a later date.
Isse Koch was acquitted of charges of misuse of funds, although her involvement, I think her involvement is clear by her being included in the trial in the first place, that many SS officers believed that she did take part in running of the camp and certainly knew about many of the corrupt elements of the Koch administration.
Ilse remained at the camp. With her husband out of the picture, she sought male allies. She had affairs with several high-ranking SS officers.
Some of the men worked outside the fence and the SS barracks and so on, and they brought back stories also about her sexuality and that she was going with all different SS men and officers.
In 1944, Karl returned to Buchenwald to face trial for corruption. Torture and murder was nothing compared to ripping off the Reich. On a cold morning in April 1945, Karl was taken outside and shot in the yard of his own camp. As the Russians advanced and the Third Reich began to crumble, Ilse realized her days of indulgence were over. She attempted to melt back into the German population and joined thousands heading westwards, looking for safety from the Allies. On the 10th of April 1945, the US Army entered Buchenwald. The camp was built to house 8,000. The population had swelled to 10 times that number. 100,000 people had died at the camp in 7 years.
Well, the American liberators, when they first walked into the camp, were shocked by what they saw. They were absolutely stunned. Many of the prisoners were walking skeletons. They had been so systematically starved that they had no body fat left. One of the French generals told the Americans that he normally weighed 170 pounds, and he weighed at that time 85 pounds.
They found corpses lying around beside the crematorium, for example, and lots of people stuck in these overcrowded barracks in the little camp. This was so shocking for them that General Patton ordered that the people from Weimar, more than 1,000, mostly Nazi party members, should be sent up here to see what happened up here.
1,200 civilians walked from the neighboring city of Weimar to begin a forced tour of the camp. There are many smiling faces, and according to observers, at first the Germans act as though this was something being staged for their benefit. On a table for all to gaze upon is a lampshade made of human skin, made at the request of an SS officer's wife. The camera records the changes in facial expressions as the Weimar citizens leave the parchment display.
But the liberated prisoners hadn't forgotten Isse Koch. She was finally caught and imprisoned in 1947. She went for trial whilst pregnant by a fellow inmate. Ilse was charged with personally selecting prisoners for murder. A gruesome selection of skins and shrunken heads was shown to the court. She denied everything and claimed she had been framed by the Allies. Crowds gathered outside the courtroom, calling for her execution. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. By 1967, Ilse had been in prison for 24 years. During this time, she'd shown no remorse or sorrow for her crimes. On the 1st of September, she knotted some bedsheets together and hanged herself. She was 61 years old. In a final letter, she'd written, "There is now no other way for me. Death is the only deliverance."
And History Night continues after the break as we learn how the decadent behaviour of royals such as Henry VIII have turned them into a laughing stock.